The first question I think we need to ask for this election, and I think a lot of people in the audience will be asking this, is, was this the Obama election? And then they'll be very quickly giving the answer, no, it wasn't. And then we've got to say, well, why isn't that? And I think one of my main contentions on this is that the Obama model, quite simply, isn't suited to UK political parties. We don't run a presidential system. And I would liken the Obama model to working well, because presidential elections are in essence like startup campaigns, and we have old political parties in this country which have long traditions, which are very difficult to turn around, but turn them around we will, to a more modern and electronic form of campaigning, but nonetheless we're not a startup. For our own part, for our own campaign, we had a primary objective that we started work on 2.5 years ago, to build a website organised primarily around policy issues, optimised for search, aimed at one particular audience, floating voters, on one particular day, May the 6th as it turned out to be, to make sure that when people were searching on Google they were able to find us. It was not necessarily the most fashionable strategy in the world, because I know we're going to talk a lot about Twitter and Facebook, which made up a part of our campaign, and I believe we were successful with, but the central part for us was the web strategy, the email strategy, making sure we were getting return on our investment in terms of people volunteering with the party and also raising money as well. And I think that was a success and worked well for us. I would say overall, you know, an incredibly interesting election for all sorts of reasons. Even though it did end up turning out to be the TV debate election and not necessarily the internet election, a lot of really interesting interventions from all the political parties that I'm really looking forward to hearing about from all the other guys representing those other parties here tonight. And, you know, there we go. I'm really interested in what you guys have got to ask about it all too.
Well, it's interesting because coalition is something that we're very familiar with in Ireland, north and south. In the north, we have to have a coalition. It's the law that everybody who gets over a certain amount of seats has to be in the government, whether they bloody well like it or not. And in the south, just to give you an idea, the last of Bertie Ahern's attempts to pull together a coalition took 3 months. So if these guys can do it in a couple of weeks, that's pretty good. They've got the cabinet all named already, so perhaps things aren't that difficult, and people shouldn't be quite so fearful of coalitions as they clearly were. Well, certainly some Conservatives were, I think, towards the end of that campaign. Very, very briefly, in terms of the outcome, I think it's a really intelligent outcome by what is possibly the first really intelligent electorate. And I think, although there's been a lot of stuff said about the TV debates, I think one important thing to note about those is they were, by and large, by gift of about 75 kind of different rules, unmediated by any journalistic intervention. It was very much the three guys themselves trying to make their own plays. But also we had a journalistic class that by and large weren't getting outside the Westminster bubble, but were being fed by things like polls on a daily basis. I mean, certainly it was way beyond any of my experience to see polls come in just quite as quickly as they did this time. And also the tool that I think probably topped everything else out, and this is the whole blogosphere in toto, was the electoralcalculus.co.uk. The BBC used a version of it, the Telegraph used a version of it, and that was really interesting because it absolutely put the swingometer, the old binary two-party thing, absolutely into what Peter Robinson, the DUP, might call a Sadducee's grave. And in a sense, it gave people a sense of possibility. And what we've got is actually a rather equitable hedging of the bets. Even Labour managed to get their beleaguered and very often bewildered PM out of number 10 with a degree of grace that probably was impossible to imagine 6 months ago. The Lib Dems have got their orange bookers, the intellectual caste of the Liberal Democrats, into power for the first time in many, many generations. So there's a real sense of possibility there that they can begin to make themselves as real politicians and relinquish their role, their long-term role as the UK's political theoreticians. And David Cameron has pretty much, in bringing the Liberal Democrats in, rid himself of the millstone of the Tory right, the kind of the anti-European, anti-EU, anti-future, anti-internet, anti-everything. And the guys he has to deal with now are much more equitable and, you know, well-educated chaps
stop you there, Mick.
like himself.
I'm going to stop you there because I've never heard you be so positive about anything before in my life. I go to somebody, James. It's not so much how delighted we are to be where we are, but what about how we got there?
I mean, it seems to me there's a fundamental distinction between the technologies you can see and the technologies that you can't. the visible technologies in this election were a disappointment, I think, although not very many people expected Twitter and Facebook to make that much of a difference. The invisible ones are the really interesting ones, and they're also the ones where we genuinely don't know what impact they had. The use of databases, the use of email, and sort of postal marketing, the use of search engine optimization, unless the parties are going to tell us what they did, it's quite difficult to tell. There are some things that you can say. I disagree with Craig about the sort of capacity for a British-style Obama election. This was a fascinating natural experiment where at least one party, the Liberal Democrats, had an Obama surge after the first week, and it didn't appear that the party was set up to be able to take advantage of it. The Conservatives also had the capacity in their My Conservatives platform, and my sense was that while that was technically well put together, it didn't actually work. And I think you may disagree with that, but it would be interesting to think about why that didn't happen, because the capacity was there. I mean, two further examples of innovation, because it wasn't just the parties that we're talking about here. I'm a trustee of mysociety.org, and there were two projects that we ran, one of which worked fantastically well, and one of which worked pretty well and was a bold experiment. The first, the Straight Choice, the election leaflet crowdsourcing campaign, which was a sort of knock it out of the park success, I think, did for election leaflets in this election what the Plane Spotters did for rendition in the CIA, in spotting what all the parties were up to and not letting them get away with it. And I think that little dirty corner of British electioneering will never be the same again because of the internet. And Democracy Club, where we got at least one volunteer and sometimes dozens in every constituency in the UK and tried to do a mass participation political compass, worked halfway there and is a sort of great example of what you can do to, bring lots of people together around the internet. So examples of innovation, but I think as an Obama-style campaign, it certainly didn't get there. But I'm not sure that I accept Craig's explanation that that's because of something fundamentally broken. I mean, I think there was opportunities to do that and they were missed.
Well, actually, I'm quite pleased with what everyone else has said, because I'm normally worried at conferences like this. It's a bit like political conferences where after the first couple of days, everything that needs to be said has been said, but not everybody has said it yet. So it sort of goes on for hours and hours. I take a very, very different view about what happened at this election and the role that online campaigning played in it, not least from my own experience in Walthamstow. And I say that as somebody who has absolutely no technical ability at all. I don't know how to work my own website and how to put things into it, but I don't actually know when it goes wrong how to fix it. But I've always approached all platforms with the same, both offline and online, attitude, which is how can they help me engage with people? How can they help me reach out to people? How can they help me have the conversations that I needed to have as a local politician and indeed at a national level about the kind of politics and the kind of policies that I wanted to advocate and I believe that the election should be about? So in that sense, I used online media in all sorts of different ways. I have to say I didn't blog, and that maybe what marks me out, because blogging feels to me a bit like, particularly in election campaigns, like when you used to go around with a speakerphone kind of shouting your opinions at people on the street and demanding that they vote for you. It's not very interactive. And I think one of the things that to me that's very striking about what Labour did at this election, as I say, both nationally and locally, was frankly because we didn't have the money to spend on very expensive platforms, we were forced to be innovative and we were forced to ask, actually, what's the best way to use these technologies to support the kind of contact and the engagement that we wanted to do? I'll give you an example from my own campaign about what I did. I've ended up with about 3,000 local people's email addresses. Every week they get an email from me about the things I find out that are happening in Walthamstow so that they get information about what's going on in their area. Critically, it's also about how they can get involved in that campaigning activity. I know it's a success because I get complaint emails from people about the fact they've had it forwarded to them several times, so I know that people find it useful. I also reckon I picked up probably about 500 or 600 votes from Twitter, from using Twitter not just to tweet about myself, but to actually follow and interact with people talking about Walthamstow, talking about our local area, and to have the conversation with them about what difference I wanted to make in our local community. At a national level, I think some of the viral videos that we put together, some of the work that was done through Membersnet that allowed us to convert one of the classic problems that political parties have, particularly at general election times, which is people being interested in being part of what you're doing, but finding it very difficult to find out how to be involved, or indeed to then have that interest be honoured and engaged with. Online technology allowed the Labour movement to do that in a way that frankly was a lot cheaper than perhaps when I first started campaigning for Labour quite a while ago, when actually, frankly, it was a very lonely experience, and you were lucky if you got a nice branch secretary who was nice to you and said, yes, all right, we're leafleting this day. Most of the time you got somebody who said, well, why weren't you here Saturday? because we were all there then. You know, the fact that the party was able to use online technologies to reach out and engage with people across the country and direct them to marginal seats, but also to share ideas and kind of interest about what was happening on the ground. So I was involved in something called Mob Monday, where actually people were tweeting about the fact that they were campaigning, making calls for Labour. Again, not something that we'd ever done before, but it generated that sense of camaraderie and fraternity that actually you weren't on your own wanting a progressive alternative. Now, notwithstanding the result of the final election, I do actually think all these technologies, certainly, as I say, I think they made a real difference to me in Walthamstow. I think this election is a bit of a benchmark for me, because whether next time round I'll get people tweeting and telling me I've just been to vote for you and I've told everyone at the polling station to vote for you, which I had, which I didn't expect at all, and thought, well, you know, is my opponent getting these or not? Clearly not. And whether the work that was done at a national level will be converted, because I think that's the other thing about this. And I have lots of ideas about where this technology goes next and the engagement that we need to keep doing. I think the challenge for the next election, whether they're local, national, regional, is people understanding that technology and innovating with it, because I was very lucky in that my opponents were not using online campaigning at all. So it was an open goal for me, frankly, to be able to reach out and engage with people in Walthamstow to do that. And I also happen to think that the way in which Labour engaged at a national level was fundamentally different and, frankly, better in terms of engagement. Rather than the emails that the Tories were putting out. That will change at the next election, just as every election people pick up on good leaflets, good campaigning techniques and use them. So the challenge will be, what's the next innovation? What's the next way of engaging with people that gives you that edge at the next election? And that's, I guess, a state secret for all of us. So.
Yeah. The national media were convinced this was going to be the digital election, and it didn't quite materialise. Not to say there weren't successes. It ended up being the TV election in the end, but Labour went into this election campaign claiming to be the party of social media without really realising that there's a very big difference between the internet as a whole and social media as very one small part of it. And the party who, as Stella was saying, you know, were using Mob Monday. They were doing good things, but ultimately Twitter was more of a hindrance to the Labour Party than it was a gain. They lost two candidates through things they'd written online on Twitter. We had Stuart McLennan up in Scotland with his less than exemplary sense of humour, and then we had John Cowan, which was a slightly darker aspect of harassment online. And even Labour's Twitter czar, Kerry McCarthy, ended up under police investigation. By the end of the campaign, she was being investigated by the police for publishing polling numbers from postal votes on Twitter. So people need to tread very carefully with the internet. The great thing about it for people in my field, such as a blogger or any journalist really, is the internet lasts forever. And anything that was said during that campaign will come back to haunt anyone who said it during the election. We've spoken broadly about the fact it wasn't really the digital election, but we were experimenting with different things. As my day job, I work for a transparency anti-corruption group, and we put together, in just one constituency against Ed Balls, we put together an attack ad, which was then posted very locally on the local newspaper websites, only seen in his constituency. And I think that sort of progression of new tactics, of very, very local-based politics, is where we're going to see the internet at the next election, be it in October or in 5 years' time.
I just want to quickly go on to, you know, was this the digital election? It's become quite a sort of hackney question, but I don't think it was. But I think it was a digital election. Now, there's three ways in which this works. Can you hear the political campaign online? Is it amplified through online media? And then is it driven by online media? Well, you can certainly hear the campaign online. I'm doing a report for the phone company Orange, and we did a survey with YouGov. Almost 60% of people accessed information about this election online, so that's a pretty big hit. Was it amplified through online media? Well, after the leaders' debate, people were going online and doing searches about Nick Clegg, Gordon Brown, David Cameron. There is a surge in support, a surge in searches for Nick Clegg after each of the first two leaders' debates. Towards the end, there's a surge in searches to be done on Gordon Brown. That was more to do with Gillian Duffy than it was to do with the leaders' debates themselves. And then is it driven by the internet and digital media? Well, the answer is probably not. Although, interestingly, amongst the sort of 18 to 24-year-old age group, 24% of people actually engaged in social media to discuss the election. And I think that's pretty phenomenal, and that's clearly a pointer of where things are going. Now, Coming on to the Obama campaign, that is the ideal type for a digital campaign. Integration between traditional campaigning, new media, message delivery, that also allows you to energize, mobilize pools of support and activists that actually have an impact on the doorstep. And none of the parties did achieve that. But all three did various things well. The Conservative Party, I thought, did very well on message delivery. If you did a search on Google on David Cameron and Gordon Brown, the top sponsored link was one to the Conservative Party website. The Labour Party did very well on engaging its activists, and Stella's incredibly impressive local campaign is one example of that, and the word-of-mouth thing I think was very powerful. And Stella didn't actually say, but I think you actually achieved a swing to Labour in your constituency, which I think is absolutely incredible. The Liberal Democrats, of course, shifted from looking at the more sort of policy side of their campaign to actually capturing some of this wave of support that Nick Clegg managed to generate. So all three of the parties did different things very well. So it was an internet election, and that the internet election and digital media was an important part of this election, I think, but we're still waiting for our first digital election.